Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Executive Director and Chief Economist at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, Heather Boulais.
Okay, all right, so there we go. Is that on? So good morning. It is my honor to be able to welcome you all here today. Thank you all for coming. I hope you are enjoying breakfast. And for those of you who are watching online, you don't get breakfast, but hopefully you will get a great set of conversations today. I am Heather Boulais. I'm Executive Director and Chief Economist here at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. We are an organization dedicated to understanding whether and how inequality affects economic growth and stability in order to inform the policymaking process. And one of the big questions that we've been thinking about and that we're here to talk about today is that this current economic recovery, which started about 7 years ago, is now what they call long in the tooth. It's been going on for quite a while, and maybe that doesn't mean anything, and maybe that doesn't mean that a recession is around the corner, but it certainly is probably not too soon to start thinking about how to prepare in terms of policy responses and how to think about how we can extend this current recovery for as long as we can. Now, of course, the benefits from the economic recovery have not been evenly distributed, as income has continued to flow disproportionately to those at the top. But the experiences and what we've learned over the past few years can help us understand both how inequality affects the path of the recovery, the potential for recession, and policymakers' responses. These are all the reasons why we're so pleased to bring together today a number of policymakers in the past and presently who've been there in the trenches grappling with this issue on the policy substance and in the political debates. Now, of course, a lot has changed since the last recession, which began in late 2007. Back then, we were aware of the fact that we were living in an era of high inequality, but research since then has been showing how the importance of understanding how inequality exacerbated the recession is only now starting to come to the fore. So what does that mean for the next time, given that inequality has only continued to increase? And how can we make sure that growth reaches everyone? What policies can play a role in both boosting growth and decreasing economic inequality? Thinking about the design and desirability of fiscal policy has changed and now may constitute a new view on fiscal policy. Using evidence from the Great Recession and lessons from new research can help guide our thinking on whether and how to use fiscal policy to pull our country out of a recession or to prevent it from even going there in the first place. Before the Great Recession, pushing nominal interest rates below zero seemed completely ridiculous. It was not something that we would have talked about in a session like this. And yet here we are understanding the very real fact that this is something that policymakers need to grapple with. We also can see now the severity and the strain, that the severity of the Great Recession put a strain on social safety nets, while also exposing some of its holes. So what do we need to do to shore up our safety net and our automatic stabilizers now, or can we even do anything? Identifying and finding solutions to these flaws will be critical to mitigating any potential impact of a next recession on working families. And these are things that we can't wait till the last minute to do. The global impact of U.S. monetary policy and its relationship to the global economy were not fully grappled with previously. With all these changes, it's clear that while past experience is necessary, it's not sufficient for the future. So I want to just say a couple of words about just probably a sentence or two about the current political climate. I think now we're in a moment where we're talking about some very big policy changes that will affect both the micro and the macro economy. We're having a conversation about a very large infrastructure program. We're having a conversation about reducing taxes at the top and a massive tax break for firms that want to repatriate their profits from overseas. We're talking about the importance of the independence of the Federal Reserve, among other things. And we're also talking about trade policy and how that looks moving forward. Each of those are issues that will affect not only the potential for a recession, but what we can do about it, and all of them have implications for economic equity and growth. And I know we're going to hear from all of our panelists today on a variety of these issues. So to start off this conversation, I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Larry Summers. Now, of course, Larry is someone who needs no introduction. And I will just note that the idea for this conference and this conversation came out of a conversation him and I had started on a street corner as he was trying to hail a cab about a year ago, thinking about what it is that policymakers would need to grapple with at this moment in the economic cycle and in this moment in the political process. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce him today. So Lawrence Summers is the Charles W. Eliot University Professor and President Emeritus of Harvard University. Over the course of the past 2 decades, he's served in a series of senior policy roles in Washington, including being the 71st Secretary of the Treasury for President Clinton, Director of the National Economic Council for President Obama, and Vice President of Development Economics and Chief Economist of the World Bank. In the past several years, Larry has resuscitated and pushed forward in the public debate an idea around secular stagnation. This is the idea that the U.S. economy is in a period of sluggish economic growth, low interest rates, and a deficiency of aggregate demand. This thesis has clear implications for not only how to boost economic growth, but also in thinking about the best course of action to help counter recessions. We're very thrilled to be able to hear from here today, and I'd like to welcome Larry up to the podium.
Thank you, Heather, and I'm glad to be here, and thank you for the very important work the Washington Center on Equitable Growth does, and thank you for your leadership. And let me just say, these are not the circumstances in which I expected to be here. When I accepted this invitation, I thought this was likely to be the first Washington conclave after the election of a Democratic administration, and that there'd be much excited discussion of possible directions that that administration could take. I feel impelled, before I turn to what I might know something about economics, to just record my degree of concern about the direction that our country has taken, which I believe is without precedent in the last century. There are people who are afraid in large number because of what they heard about the groups to which they belonged during the last presidential campaign. I wish I could tell them that their fear was irrational or unfounded. Watching that campaign, watching the appointments that have been made by the new president-elect, I do not feel I can tell them that that fear is unfounded. I am someone who has been concerned about what I have in the past regarded as excesses of political correctness on college campuses, alarm about microaggressions, stopping parties that involve sombreros, and the like. And I think those concerns that I expressed had validity. But whatever validity they have is dwarfed by the vicious attacks underway on minorities in the name of resisting political correctness. And so that is a word I do not intend to use in the future. And as important as the economic issues that we're going to discuss are, I do not think any of us should lose sight of the basic issues of values that are at stake in our country over the next 4 years. Economics. Look, I think the core of our current predicament is that we had a grave financial crisis that very substantially depressed output, that the very substantial financial crisis passed, that credit spreads normalized, banks started to function again, markets started to do all right, and one would have expected the economy to catch up, to at least catch up some towards the trend you would have expected for the economy in 2007 and 2008, and that over 8 years there has been no such catch-up. That growth since the trough of the recession has been slower than people expected potential GDP growth to be at that time. Economists still struggle to understand why that is, and complex phenomena have many causes. I am convinced that two are of central importance in understanding what has happened. The first is what I've referred to as the new secular stagnation, what others more prosaically refer to as the decline in the neutral real interest rate, a very substantial increase in the propensity to save, caused by many factors: increased inequality, what's happening in the developing world, demographic changes, a higher share of corporate profits, and a very substantial reduction in the propensity to invest, caused also by many factors: demographic changes, the demassification of the economy, falling prices of information, technology, sludged up financial intermediation, and much else. The result is that at traditional interest rate levels, the economy is unable to generate sufficient demand to provide full employment. And it is a failure to appreciate that reality that is the reason why forecasts have consistently been too optimistic, and the Fed has for 8 years had the same interest rate forecast that takeoff of interest rates would occur in 9 months, and it has never taken place. The second phenomenon that I believe is of profound importance is hysteresis, is the reality that depressed economies, through a whole variety of mechanisms, cast a shadow forward onto future potential. Some of it is people who've been out of work for a long time, losing the capacity and the will to work. Some of it is substantial reductions in research and development expenditures during recessions. Some of it is less investment of other kinds that don't show up as investment in reorganizing firms, experimenting with new products, and the like. The result is what I've called inverse Say's law, that lack of demand creates its own lack of supply. And these two phenomena together account, I believe, in significant part for the current predicament of the United States and the industrialized world. Now, I am well aware that there are many who say, well, the unemployment rate is now pretty low. How can you blame this on demand given that the unemployment rate is pretty low? I would simply refer them to the most basic bit of economic reasoning that you learn in your first introductory economics course. And that is that if the quantity of apples goes down, and you are trying to figure out whether that's because there's a lower supply of apples or there is a lower demand for apples, you look at the price. And if the price has gone up, you think it's a lower supply of apples. And if the price has gone down, you think it's a lower demand for apples. And it is very clear that inflation and expected inflation have declined very substantially in the United States and throughout the industrialized world. At least until a week ago, and still today, markets were unambiguous in their verdict that expected inflation everywhere in the industrialized world over the next 10 years was distinctly below the Federal Reserve's 2% target. So it is against that backdrop that I believe we need to assess economic policy. I believe that much of what alarms us in the financial sector, increases in leverage, valuations that look to some like bubbles, bizarrely low interest rates, are the consequence of the phenomena I have described. A combination of a high savings propensity with a low investment propensity and a slow expected rate of growth leads money to flow into existing assets, makes leverage attractive, and therefore accounts for much of what is of financial concern. Now, what is to be done? And what is to be done in the current environment? The worst personal financial mistake I ever made was many years ago. I was attempting to sell a house, and we had a realtor, an uncharismatic realtor, who told us that the house was worth X, and we attempted to sell the house, and after a couple of months, we had had very little success in selling the house, and the realtor told us we would probably need to lower the price. And another realtor came and told us, no, the first realtor's an idiot. I really know how to advertise. I really know how to promote. I've sold a lot of houses before. I really know what I'm doing. All you need to do is turn to me and market the house at X plus 10%, and you will do splendidly. We ended up selling the house 9 months later with the first realtor for X minus 15%. And that, I would suggest, is the risk that the United States faces today. The laws of politics may or may not be immutable. There is always room for discussion, and politics and ideology changes. But I would suggest that the laws of arithmetic and the laws of economics have much more constancy. And what is on offer today constitutes, in important respects, a denial of those laws, and the result is likely to be, much as my result was selling my house, extraordinarily unfortunate. I should say that Rudy Dornbush, late Rudy Dornbush of MIT, and other economists have studied very extensively the economics of populism and have written about what they've referred to as the populist policy cycle, the tendency for populist policies to produce a kind of short-run sugar high, followed by consequences that are most serious for those in whose name the policies have been advocated. Let me give 3 examples. It is, in my view, wrong-headed and seriously mistaken, but it is internally consistent to advocate the elimination of Obamacare. It is not internally consistent and coherent to advocate the elimination of Obamacare and the preservation of no risk testing for health insurance beneficiaries. No risk taking no risk rating means an adverse selection spiral that eliminates the individual health insurance market. Because in the absence of risk rating, why sign up for health insurance until you are sick And if only you sign up when you are sick, then the premiums are going to have to be very high. And when the premiums rise, you have to be even sicker before it is worthwhile to sign up, and it implodes. It is not a coherent, logically constructible proposal to preserve risk rating and eliminate the measures to include the healthy in health insurance through mandates that are the center of Obamacare. Let me give you a second example. And here I can point to damage that has already been done. The evidence is overwhelming from tracking the data that the Mexican peso is now 10% lower than it would have been as a consequence of Donald Trump's rhetoric and election. And a number of other emerging market countries' currencies are depressed by 3 to 5%. What does that depressed Mexican peso mean? It means that every export from Mexico to the United States is potentially 10% cheaper on sale in the United States. It means that every American product on sale in Mexico potentially costs 10% more. And it means that there's a 10% cost advantage that did not previously exist for any producer thinking about relocating in Mexico rather than the United States. This has to be seen as a bizarre strategy for protecting Americans from Mexican competition. Much the same is true with respect to many other emerging markets. Once again, attractive visions do not square with evident laws of arithmetic and economics. A third example is with respect to subsequent budgetary arithmetic. Here there is less clarity to do the calculation and to do the analysis. But the first law of troubled situations is that if the things you observe are deeply troubled, the things you cannot yet observe are probably deeply troubled as well. That's why once one saw the Ohio vote last Tuesday night, one should have been very alarmed about what was to come. And that's why one needs to be very alarmed about the budget arithmetic that is put forward in these proposals. Fiscal stimulus locked in today is fiscal stimulus that cannot be provided when the next recession comes. Of particular seriousness is possible measures that do not just sacrifice tax revenue in the present, but sacrifice tax revenue into the indefinite future. Let me give you 3 examples. If you repeal the estate and gift tax, all of those with great fortunes can set their great-great-grandchildren up through trusts, through gifts today, and even if that tax base is replaced in 4 years, there is no substantial tax base that can then be utilized to raise revenue. Large-scale reductions in capital gains taxes will permit all of the substantial fortunes that have been earned to this point to avoid taxation, calling into question the future tax base, even if capital gains taxes are subsequently increased. And probably of the most relevance for the debate, measures which allow all of the $2.5 trillion to come back that is now abroad to come back at an extremely low tax rate are sacrificing future tax revenue and the future capacity of the tax base. It is of the utmost importance that we resist measures that do not just allow policies we don't prefer during this presidential term, but cast a shadow that locks in policies we loathe into the indefinite future. These, in a way, are questions of arithmetic and questions of economic logic. There are also questions that are more fundamentally ideological that lie ahead of us. Questions of the dangers of truculence towards an uncertain and confused world, alliance with those who are adversarial towards fundamental American values. There are questions of abandonment of basic social and environmental protections that are crucial to the kind of society that we represent. I think of the environmental area in particular, and the climate denier who is leading the EPA transition team. There are questions of ethics in government and the consistency of the application of traditional rules with respect to financial conflicts. And there are questions of basic social cohesion and basic protection for those who have been left behind in our society, both directly through attacks on them and through the indirect consequence of strategies that create massive fiscal holes and then require large-scale spending cuts, making attacks on the poor inevitable. The poor in the United States have never faced a threat like an absolute commitment to maintain middle-class entitlements, a commitment to massive tax cuts, and a commitment to a large-scale defense buildup. That trio is a weapon directly targeted at the poor and the minority in the United States. And so I would say to you that these are potentially very dangerous times in the economic sphere, that our response will need to take place at several levels. One, clear, vivid, and concerted opposition to the many aspects of the program that either are offensive to our deepest values or are in contradiction with the laws of economics and arithmetic. And two, because, as Hillary Clinton said in her so eloquent concession speech, their times do change, the wheel does turn. Preparation for a different season when we can, with a bold and positive spirit, address the challenges facing all Americans, and with the technical know-how, confidence, and sound policy analysis that will enable us to meet what I believe are the very different economic challenges of this era that, in my view, center importantly on secular stagnation and hysteresis, but others will have different theories and different views as to how they can be best met. And so, Heather, I don't think the work that you and this organization do, I don't think the work that the people in this room do has ever been more important than it is today. Thank you very much.
Larry, thank you so much. I was interested why you did not mention the President-elect's trade policy, which he has said on the first day one, as well as in the first 100 days, at different times he said different things, about raising tariffs either on Mexico or on China. And in your list of 3 things and how it will affect, if you will, the public, it would seem to me raising tariffs by 45%, for example, on China is going to hit the pocketbooks of some of his, of everyone, in particular his supporters. So in your list of 3, I was wondering where trade politics is, particularly because I think that's been the most important of all the things that he has articulated and promised to his public.
I was talking, when I spoke of the depreciation of the peso and when I spoke of the depreciation of other emerging market currencies, I was speaking about the consequences of his trade policies. I think we have to decide. I think we have to decide our argument, and you can make. There are 2 arguments you can make, but you can't really make both of them at the same time. One argument you can make is the argument that I made, which is that the cumulative effect of this is going to be to reduce capital flows to emerging markets and increase capital flows out of emerging markets, and therefore to move emerging markets towards trade surplus with the United States, and therefore to, in association with that, an appreciation of the dollar, and in association with that, reduced competitiveness for American workers in all the places. That's one argument you can make. That's an argument that says that at least in the short run, you're benefiting consumers because a stronger dollar means a more favorable American terms of trade. The other argument you can make is your argument, which is essentially the opposite, that the dominant effect is the increase in tariffs, and that, in effect, you're raising substantially the price of consumers and providing substantial protection to American workers. And so, in effect, you're engaged in a classic protectionist policy, and that does operate to protect jobs at the very substantial sacrifice of consumer interests. And you can't argue it's one way or the other. Either it's higher consumer prices and more protection for jobs, or lower consumer prices and less protection for jobs. And my judgment in the short run is that what's a little more likely to happen is a version of the early 1980s period in which it goes the other way. But you may be right, and it may be that the right argument to make is the consumer interests argument. I think there are others who can speak more knowledgeably to the politics than I can. I think that traditionally, at least, arguing the consumer benefits of trade has only been a mixed, has not been enormously effective. And as I say, what we're already seeing at this moment, it's pretty clear what the effect is. It may be that that's in anticipation of something that will happen. My suspicion is we will not see tariffs of anything like that magnitude, and that what we in fact will see is a dangerous decline in the currencies of the emerging markets that will be a substantial threat to jobs and competitiveness and the very interests that the president-elect has spoken about. But it's an empirical judgment. The only thing I would insist on is that when we are accusing others with respect to the laws of arithmetic, we too have to respect the laws of arithmetic, and we can't argue it both ways. There will be a temptation to argue that it's going to raise consumer prices massively, and at the same time it's going to reduce competitiveness. And it's very hard to argue both sides of that, argue both sides at the same time. Yes, sir.
Hello? Your view is somber, and I think rightly so, but equity and bond markets have reacted quite differently. What's your comment on that?
Yeah. If you look at Dornbusch's research on populist policy cycles in Latin America, there's always a kind of sugar high at the beginning where everybody feels good, where there's more demand and it looks like there's going to be more profits and purchasing power goes up because the exchange rate appreciates and everybody feels really pretty good about things. And then it all tends to come apart. So I think that's the first. So I think that is the first substantial answer. I think the second answer is that the interests of the stock market and the interests of the economy do not always coincide. There's the famous old quip that the stock market has predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions, and something similar must be true with respect to booms. And then there is the observation that when you pursue a systematic strategy of transferring wealth from workers and consumers to corporations through the evisceration of basic protections, you are going to see the markets judge that the present value of profits is greater. And if you look within the stock market rally, you will find that it is pharmaceutical stocks that have taken off in anticipation of the government stopping using its purchasing power on behalf of the American people to hold down costs. You will see that it is financial stocks rising in anticipation of the removal of basic consumer protections. You will find that perhaps the best performing sector is the coal sector in anticipation of the politics of climate denial and so forth. So I think in substantial part, it reflects the divergent interests of the owners of certain spheres of capital and the broader economic interests. And I also think it reflects a kind of myopia. And my caution would be that markets can have and do move very quickly. And while it's, in my view, always a mistake to ignore what markets are saying, it is an even greater mistake to slavishly suppose either that they are correct or that their interest is in identity with the national interest. Thank you very much.